Cohasset Historical Society and the Community Outreach. I'm thrilled to be starting off our maritime series with David Robertson, who we met last year, and we were thrilled at the Maritime Museum. And he said he'd be willing to share some of his amazing stories from his amazing job as the state underwater archaeologist and for the Massachusetts Board of Underwater Archaeological Resources. That's kind of a mouthful.
That's a lot of syllables.
And so, yeah.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, hello everyone.
Hello.
Thank you so much for coming tonight. It's I've been to Cohasset twice, 3 times.
Third time.
This is the 3rd time, right?
Yeah, because you did it with the fly.
Right. And the other 2 times it was kind of cold and I think it was beautiful on the way here today. I drove about 2 hours to get here. It's a lovely ride once you get into this area. So are you all from here? You all live here? Beautiful place, boy. I'm envious. It's a gorgeous community you've got. Well, welcome. This happens to be the part of the job that I have as the state underwater archaeologist that I actually enjoy the most. I have to admit I'm an introvert by nature, but interacting and sharing with the public, with folks like yourself, and sharing all the different aspects of what I do in this job that I have, this unique job as state underwater archaeologist, it's incredibly rewarding because I'm excited by this topic, and when I talk to other people, you get excited by it. I mean, whether I'm on a plane or I'm on the subway or I just talk to somebody and I tell them what I do for work, we instantly start a conversation. People are just inherently interested in this particular topic area. So tonight, what I'm going to talk about is there's a few things I wanted to touch on, and these topics were based on a conversation that I had with Susan of the Cohasset Historical Society, who you probably all know, when we had a conversation about, how many of you even knew you had a state underwater archaeologist? All right. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. That's typically the response that I get and I give these talks a lot. And when I ask people, usually it's about 10 or 15% of the audience. And so that tells me that I have to do more of this, and I have to do this in a different way. I have to and take advantage of the new technologies. But I'm really happy that you're here tonight and that we can have a conversation about what BUAR is, the Board of Underwater Archaeological Resources, what I do, a little bit about my background, and then share with you some information about some of the types of sites that we have here in the state. And then you folks are going to be some of the first to hear some of the initial results of a study that we're in the process of completing at BUAR and at Massachusetts Office of Coastal Zone Management. It's a 2-year study that we've been working on to assess the vulnerability of coastal cultural resources to coastal hazards like erosion and sea level rise. So you're going to be some of the first people to see some of this initial data, and I'm really excited to share that with you. All right. So, yeah, I am your state underwater archaeologist. I am also the director. That's me in my business suit, and I am the director and chief archaeologist of the Board of Underwater Archaeological Resources. How does somebody get to have a job like that? Well, I went to school at the Texas A&M Institute of Nautical Archaeology and the Nautical Archaeology program there to get a master's degree. That's what gave me the professional credentials to be an underwater archaeologist. Before that, I studied at the University of Rhode Island, and I majored in anthropology and art. And then I worked on a PhD at the University of Connecticut, did all the coursework, but then life got in the way, and I didn't finish the degree, but I did learn a lot while I was there. So, and then prior to my position with the state, I worked as a marine research specialist at the University of Rhode Island's Graduate School of Oceanography, where I was employed working on a 7-year project to come up with methods for identifying ancient native cultural landscapes in the offshore environment. And I'll talk a little bit about those in a minute. Let's see. In between going to graduate school and standing here in front of you right now, I've spent 34 years of my life doing underwater archaeology, primarily as a consulting archaeologist. And what that means is if the Corps of Engineers is dredging a channel, if a company wants to build an offshore wind farm, those all need to go through state and federal permitting processes. And they need underwater archaeologists to make sure that there aren't any important cultural sites that are in these project areas that are going to get impacted. So I worked for companies that would get hired by the developers to do the archaeology. So that means that I got to work all over the place in lots of different types of environments on lots of different kinds of projects. So everything from working in the Gulf of Mexico, diving at the mouth of the Mississippi River, to working up in northern Maine and doing research on ancient sites up in Maine. I've done work in Denmark on submerged Stone Age sites that are 6,000 to 9,000 years old. I spent 3.5 weeks documenting the 4.5-story tall stern of the Vasa. I don't know if any of you have ever seen the shipwreck in Stockholm. It sank in 1628, and now they built a museum around it. They conserved it. It's an incredible thing if you've never seen it. And I got to spend 3 weeks on it with 6 of my students from the University of Connecticut. Did all my undergrad or my graduate field work in Lake Champlain, working on Revolutionary War sites, the world's first horse-powered ferry boat, and then for the last 20 years, really have done most of that consulting archaeology here in Massachusetts. So that put me in a good place for when this job became available, when my predecessor left the position after 32 years. Vic Mastone, who some of you may or may not recognize him, but he was here for a long time, did a great job establishing really the Board of Underwater Archaeological Resources program. And yeah, so all this led to me being here today, all these different experiences. And I have to say, it is the best job in the world. I am the luckiest guy on the planet because I get to talk and meet people like yourself, and I get to work with young people who are participating in summer camps or programs that I do with the trustees of reservations, learning about shipwrecks, learning about maritime history. This is the best part of this job. The Board of Underwater Archaeological Resources, just so you know a little bit about it, it was statutorily formed, so it was formed by state law, and it was created in 1973. And we are the sole trustee of the Commonwealth's underwater archaeological heritage. We are housed within the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, and we're administratively hosted by the Massachusetts Office of Coastal Zone Management. Our charge is to do what I'm doing right now, which is to encourage the discovery, reporting, preservation, protection of Massachusetts' underwater archaeological resources for the public's benefit. And it's that last part of that sentence that's most important. The work I do is for you, because you own these resources. You are the owners of the state's underwater archaeological resources collectively as citizens of this state. The board consists of 9 voting members plus myself. I don't vote, but the 9 voting members are representatives from the State Archaeologist's Office, the State Archivist's Office, the Director of DCR Waterways, the CZM Director, the Chief of the Massachusetts Environmental Police, and the Executive Director of the Massachusetts Historical Commission, or their designees. And then we have 3 citizen-filled positions on the board, seats on the board. And these are appointed by the governor. You can go online, you can apply directly to the governor's boards, committees, or commissions website where they have the applications online. And I encourage you, if you have an interest in this, please do apply. And at these 3 seats, 2 of them require that you are a certified recreational diver. And in one case, one of those seats, you have to be nominated by one of the recognized clubs in the state of Massachusetts. The other one you can be in at large, just a diver who's not affiliated with the club. And then the other seat is for somebody that has marine archaeology background and experience and credentials. In terms of our jurisdiction, so if you look at that map, the beige area that you see going out from the coast out to the federal waters limit, and then all the inland waters and wetlands of the state, that's our jurisdiction. So I'm one guy in an office that we don't have an operating budget beyond my salary and my benefits, who's responsible for every bit of the submerged land in the state. It's a big job, and it's why having conversations like the one we're having tonight is important, because my hope is that you become sensitized more than maybe you already are to the importance of these archaeological resources that we have along our coast and offshore. And then you become my eyes and my ears, like some of you in this audience who have been permittees with the board and who are exactly that. You become, part of this group of stewards who protects and studies and makes us all aware about these great resources. So thank you in advance for agreeing to do that. And then we share our permitting and our jurisdiction with the Massachusetts Historical Commission within the intertidal zone. So, underwater archaeological resources, we're going to talk about them. We probably ought to define them. What are they? And don't look. No cheating. Tell me what you think they are. What they could be.
Shipwrecks.
Shipwrecks.
Anchors.
Anchors. Yes, artifacts. Yep.
Piers.
Piers. Yes, coastal infrastructure.
Lighthouse.
I don't have to give this talk. You guys already know everything. Lighthouses. Yeah. These are all part and parcel. Those are all things that date from historical times. But what about ancient times?
Sunken in indigenous sites.
Submerged indigenous sites. Yeah, absolutely. What else?
Fossils?
Hmm?
Fossils?
Fossils? Yeah, that falls under paleontology more so than archaeology, but yeah, we definitely have fossils underwater. Indigenous watercraft? They did travel by boat. So, all these things. And now we're going to see some pictures of them. Let me go back to this. So, I'll go through the definition. It's by law, it's abandoned properties, artifacts, treasure troves, or sunken ships which have remained unclaimed for 100 years or more, or which are valued at $5,000 or more, or any other objects 100 years old or judged by the board to be of historical value, which are located inside, upon, or around said resources within the inland or coastal waters of the Commonwealth as defined by Massachusetts general laws or the lands upon the lands thereunder. And as I said, the ownership of these resources collectively belongs to all of us. And that title to things like shipwrecks was confirmed by the passage of the Federal Abandoned Shipwreck Act of 1987, signed into law in 1988, that transferred ownership of shipwrecks from the federal government to states to manage. And then also provided guidelines for how the state should manage these resources. It gave advice. And so that advice is what led to the formation of state underwater archaeology offices in several states in the country. There aren't many of us. I think there's 9. But not the BUAR, because we were formed in 1973. We actually predate this
Who does
law.
the appraisal value?
So in this case, if it's something that we're looking at, we would be determining that and maybe working with a professional appraiser if it came to that. But it's interesting, I'm sure you recognize that language. It didn't sound very historic preservation-y, it sounded more monetary. And that's because in 1973, the nature of historic preservation in terms of offshore resources was very different than it is today. There it was more thinking about shipwrecks purely for their economic value as opposed to their cultural value and their historical value. And I didn't include the slide in tonight's talk. And I kind of wish I had, because it's such a poignant image. But when people ask me, you know, what are we going to learn from studying the bits and pieces of a ship? Well, you can learn a lot. We've got a gentleman here who has worked on reconstructing the original Minot's Light from pictures, from the crumbs that history has left us. We can do that with the remains of ships that are submerged on the bottom, even if they're in pieces. And the poignant part that I mentioned is I've got this picture. It's from the, have any of you ever been to the Essex Shipbuilding Museum? They have some fabulous photographs on the walls in the exhibits there. And one of the ones they have is of children around an older shipwright. And he's got a half-hull model, and he's explaining to the children, you know, about ship design and transferring that knowledge to the next generations. And that's really how people learned how to build ships. They worked in shipyards from a very early age. And that knowledge, which is so important to our history and the development of technology, maritime commerce, all of it, that was transmitted orally, primarily. And so plans and diagrams of these ships, they don't often exist. And the only place you can learn about it and reconstruct it is from the archaeological record. So that's why it's important. That's why these sites are important to study and to preserve. The way the state law is written, it is illegal for a person to remove, displace, damage, or destroy an underwater archaeological resource unless they are working under a permit from us. We have permitting authority, and we issue 3 kinds of permits. A reconnaissance permit, which is what it sounds like. It's, you know, to do basic non-disturbance type investigations of an underwater area. And then excavation permits, which allow for digging and disturbing, which is inherently destructive, and the recovery of artifacts. And then we have special use permits, and those are for things where we have professional archaeologists who are doing compliance studies for projects like I was talking about. My career was mostly doing, you know, doing pre-construction surveys for offshore wind farms or channel dredging or harbor improvements. And then the permittees that we have, they range from everything from, we've got an indigenous tribe from Massachusetts that's a permittee working on sites that are in a lake in central Massachusetts, to we've got recreational divers. We've got people who are just interested in history, and we've got professional archaeologists and corporations that are interested in sites for their financial, what they can provide financially if cargoes or artifacts of value are actually recovered. We have exceptions to these permits. The exceptions are, we have exempted sites. There's 40 of these off the coast, and they're all marked with these gold stars that you see. And these are sites that basically people have known about for a long time, and a lot of the portable artifacts around them have been already removed. So we don't permit work on these exempted sites. They're open for anybody to do casual artifact collection on, but we don't permit work on these sites. And I should definitely emphasize this point. The Federal Abandoned Shipwreck Act guaranteed access to shipwrecks. So at a federal level, and it was dictating this to the states, everyone has access to these wrecks. Anybody can dive on any shipwreck. They're not you know, we don't prevent anybody from going to these sites. So that's something that I often hear people, they don't think that's the case, but it is the case. It's protected by federal law, that access. The other exemptions that we have are isolated finds. If somebody finds something like an anchor, per se, and you know, it's all by itself, it's not part of a larger site, they can apply with an isolated find exemption form, and we will transfer title to them for that artifact. Then we have underwater archaeological preserves, and we only have one that's designated preserve. We don't provide permits to that site. And then the WITA that you've probably all heard of, the ownership of that resource was decided in court cases that predated the passage of the Abandoned Shipwreck Act. So it was essentially grandfathered in, and so that is the only shipwreck site in Massachusetts that's not owned by the state, by all of us. The other exceptions in terms of ownership are that military vessels that have not been decommissioned, those still technically belong to the country that originally owned them, unless they were getting into the weeds here, but yeah, military vessels are a different category than merchant ships. And then I know this isn't a concern for any of you, but if somebody were to vandalize a site or really do a lot of damage and steal things from a site, there are laws that penalize for that. And the penalty of somebody disturbing a site, it's a misdemeanor offense punishable by a fine of not more than $1,000, imprisonment for 6 months, or both. And any of the underwater archaeological materials that have been recovered will be confiscated, essentially. So, it is a violation of state law, and we take it seriously. The easiest way for you to get in touch with me, and I would welcome you to do so anytime you'd like, I would love to hear from you, is just to Google BUAR, will pop up, and use my email address. That's the easiest way to get a hold of me. While you're on the website, please take a look. We've got a lot of information there. We've got an overview of the work we do, all the permit requirements and exemption requirements, our laws and regulations. We have information about the exempted shipwreck sites and the preserve. We've got something that I'm going to talk about in a minute, the Shoreline Heritage Identification Partnership Strategy, or SHIPS. And then we do 5 public meetings a year, and anyone can log on. They're hybrid meetings. You can either come in person to our office in Boston, or you can go to our website. There'll be all the sign-in information for the meeting a week before the meeting, and you can sit and listen to us conduct the business of the board. We've also got a series of policy guidance documents and frequently asked questions. We have listings of our education programs, the board members, and there's a report from a study that was done a number of years ago by my predecessor on the Battle of Chelsea Creek, the anniversary of which is this year. Any of you know anything about the Battle of Chelsea Creek? It was the first, it resulted in the first capture and destruction of an enemy vessel in the Revolutionary War. It was one of the opening battles. It's pretty important. So check out the report. I think you'll find it interesting. And then we've got a number of other underwater archaeology links there. Okay, so I told you a bit about BUAR, but what does that actually translate into in terms of what does Dave do all day at work? And what I do is I manage all these things. Project review, we get about 1,500 projects a year that I have to look at and comment on, or not comment on because it's not really going to be that impactful. But I have to review all these projects. We have about 25 permittees, active permittees, that we're coordinating and administering those permits. And then we do these 5 meetings that I mentioned a year, the public meetings. I do 10 to 15 talks like this every year, at least. So we do a lot of public education and outreach. In 2021, working with the trustees of reservations, BUAR, and the trustees developed a shipwreck scholars program for a site that I'm going to tell you about in a minute, that was destroyed by overnight and ripped apart. We got handed a pile of lemons and turned it into lemonade. We created an educational program, and that included a sea shanty that I wrote that was about the history of the site. And it was my idea to bring music to the program. And this was during COVID, so this was an outdoor program that we could bring people into. And the folks I was working with, the trustees, were like, oh, a sea shanty, that'd be great. Well, I went online to find a sea shanty, and as it turns out, they're pretty bawdy, not really intended for the audience of 5 to 12 years old. And so I was like, oh boy. I guess I got to write one. So I came up with one. And it turned out to be, I think part of it was because of COVID, but singing brings people together. And this was at a time when we were all pretty separated. And so it ended up being one of the parts of the program that we all really enjoyed. But anyway, we started doing that in 2021. And then in 2022, I started doing kind of an adult version of that, the nighttime lecture and walk to check out the site. And then we do a lot of work with a veterans group, BUAR, which is their goal is to reintegrate veterans into life outside of the military by giving them a mission-based kind of a program, and that is focused on underwater archaeology in this case, or other underwater things. But in our involvement, we do underwater archaeological projects. So get to work with those great folks, and then field work. I do about 10 field projects a year where I go out and inspect sites that are reported to us, and tribal engagement. We have 2 federally recognized tribes in the state and multiple state recognized ones, and then there's some unrecognized ones, but we have a robust tribal community here in Massachusetts that we work with a lot. There's also the Commission on Indian Affairs that we coordinate with regularly. And then I work and talk a lot to the various state and federal agencies that are here that are involved in management of offshore resources, just like I am. And then one of the things I'm going to talk about towards the end of my presentation is this project that I briefly mentioned that we've been working on for the last 2 years. It's a project of special merit looking at the vulnerability of cultural resources all along the coast. So that's a lot. Right? That's kind of a lot. So what kind of sites do we have here in Massachusetts? You guys all know that the first thing that comes to mind is shipwrecks. This is the Ada K. Damon on Steep Hill Beach as it appeared in 2019, the fall of 2019, when I first got to see it. It's a vessel that was built in 1875 in Essex. And you're going to see it again. But the shipwreck that I think most of you are familiar with here in Cohasset, and if you live in Situate, is the brig of the St. John. It sank in 1849. This horribly tragic story, one of the most tragic in the history of the shipwrecks here that we have in Massachusetts. Loss of over 100 lives of these Irish immigrants who were impacted and starving from the potato famine in Ireland in the mid-19th century. And the ship ran aground right off Cohasset, and it was a total loss with tremendous loss of life. And this one hits home for me in particular because my great-grandfather was from Northern Ireland. He immigrated here by himself when he was 17, about 20 years after this happened. And so whenever I think about this, I think about him. When he left Ireland, it was right towards the end of the potato famine, but certainly he was leaving for a reason. And it's probably the same reason that they were all leaving. So we have about 3,500 reported shipwrecks in our state waters. And this is a number that was compiled by my predecessor Vic. But in conversations that we've had, we both recognize that these are just the ones that are reported. There's at least that many more that weren't, and that were early or small or were abandoned, but there are vessel remains that probably are double what that number is in our state waters. Why? Well, because we have a lot of coastline. We have almost 2,000 miles of coast that faces the Atlantic Ocean. We've got bays and harbors, and then we've got rivers, major rivers that flow through the state, over 4,000 miles of rivers. So we're bound to be a maritime-focused kind of a place. And that maritime focus doesn't extend just during the post-colonial period. It extends way before that. People were using waterways as paths for trade, for travel, for communication, for cultural exchange. All these waterways have been important for thousands and thousands of years. And so that history that we have is vast, and it's what makes, I think, our state so unique, and why we have this uncommon wealth of underwater archaeological resources here. When I was in graduate school at the University of Connecticut, and I was looking for a statistics project, I talked to Vic, and I said, has anybody done any kind of spatial analysis on where shipwrecks are located off the coast of the state? And he said, no, we haven't done that yet. And I said, well, I'd like to do that. So he shared with me the database that BUAR maintains of the shipwrecks, and I went through and I crunched all the numbers and came up with these mapping products and table that indicates where the majority, off of which communities, because in a lot of the shipwreck records, you'll hear that they sank off of Cohasset, or they sank off of Situate or Provincetown. So I used that as the indicator of where these things were and just tied them to the coastal communities that were mentioned in the records. And so what you see is, you see a non-random distribution of shipwreck locations. So red is hot, that's where we have 100+ wrecks, and you can see where they are. They're places that really aren't that surprising. Hard pieces of land that stick out into the ocean. Boston, a hub of all kinds of vessel traffic coming in, and then all these lands at the entrance going into Boston that stick out, that are hazards. And then, you know, older communities that had ports, that had a lot of maritime activity. Again, places that stick out are the places that have the most wrecks. And then looking at the different towns, of course, Boston had the most, followed by Nantucket. You know, places where if you were able to, if you had GPS trackers on all these ships that were traveling through time, you'd see, you know, these heavy lines of travel between all of the major old ports that result in this distribution. So it's not random. And in looking at, I looked at a whole variety of different variables, all the information that I could find about the vessels that were lost and what they were carrying and when they sank. And I was able to arrive on kind of an average type of shipwreck here in Massachusetts. And that would be a shipwreck that was approximately 100, or a vessel that was approximately 100 feet long, about 300 tons, wooden hulled, schooner rig, dating from the second half of the 1800s. It was less than 20 years old at the time of its loss. Probably carrying fuel oil or coal, clay, lime, stone, lumber, timber, or fish, destined for a Massachusetts port that either stranded, burned, or foundered, most likely during the winter or fall, off the coast of either Gloucester and Rockport, Boston, or Nantucket. And so that's kind of the majority of the wrecks that we have in the state fall into that category. What other kind of archaeological resources do we have? We talked a little bit about it. We have ancient indigenous watercraft and submerged ancient cultural landscapes. So the watercraft, that makes sense to most people. People have been using boats for a long time. This is one of the vessels that's in Lake Quinsigamond that I mentioned, the Nipmuc, Hassanimisco Nipmuc tribe. One of our permittees has been studying. I worked for almost 20 years with them as their project archaeologist, as a volunteer. And what caused them to apply for the permit was the report of these dugout log boats, or Mashun or Mashunish. And they're all filled with rocks to sink them for the winter. And they slid down a slope and into deep water where they couldn't be recovered. And so that's where they've been. We've radiocarbon dated one of them, and it's pre-contact. It's about 400 to 500 years old. So pretty interesting archaeological or cultural sites in the inland waters, and undoubtedly there's lots of these here in the state of Massachusetts, though we only know about a handful of them. This picture is actually not from here. This is from Rhode Island, and a project that I did when I was at URI. But what you see here, this is an indigenous scientific diver who worked with me, a student at URI, and she's looking at, this is a tree stump. You can see the roots sticking out. She's surrounded by root mat. And this is an ancient landscape that we radiocarbon dated, and it dated between 4,500 and almost 6,000 years old. And it's a drowned forest floor that was in a wetland. This is probably a cedar. And because it was in a depression, as sea level rose and sediment slumped in, it filled in quickly, and so it was protected from wave action and currents until Hurricane Sandy wiped away all the overlying sand and exposed it. and exposed it on the shoreline. We were able to trace from shore out into the water this ancient landscape. And we found a hearth, we found stone chipping debris, there was a site there. So these sites do exist underwater, and we have sites just like this, not with, I haven't been on any underwater completely subtitled that have cultural material like this one did, but these ancient landscapes are preserved here underwater. And why are they there? The sea level has risen some 350, almost 400 feet vertically since the time of the last glaciation, about the peak of the last glaciation around 20,000 years ago. Started to melt about 18,000 years ago. So it used to be that the continental shelf from the eastern seaboard, or all continental shelves worldwide, were exposed and vegetated and inhabited by animals and ancient people. And so as sea level has risen, it's submerged all this area. And so we do have remnants of those ancient landscapes. And they first started to be found, you know, when we started fishing out, like in places like George's Bank and all along the coast, where you have trawlers dragging the bottom. They're pulling up things like mastodon teeth and ancient peaty chunks of the old landscape and parts of trees and, you know, parts of this old landform that have been preserved intact, even way offshore. And we also have serendipitous finds by fishermen pulling up cultural material, pulling up stone artifacts that don't fall through the nets. And that's from in close to shore all the way out onto George's Banks. So they're there. And then this is a shocking picture of me because it's 21 years old. But when they were, I was the project archaeologist for the Cape Wind project and did all the underwater archaeology for that project. And we, as part of that survey, we found evidence of intact ancient landforms that were buried underneath the marine sediment. But they had archaeological sensitivity. So this ended up being front page news in the Boston Globe. And yeah, I used to be young. Not anymore. We also have infrastructure. Somebody said that. We have coastal infrastructure here. This is one of the mid 19th century shipyards over in East Boston, the ways for shipbuilding. We also have things like lighthouses. And you are all familiar with Minus Light. What you may not know, can I mention it?
Yeah.
So in 2007, the Foundation for Coast Guard History made a plaque to memorialize the two keepers that were killed when the original lighthouse tumbled over in 1851. That plaque was installed underwater at the site of the old lighthouse, but unfortunately galvanic corrosion caused the fasteners that were holding it to an anchor on the bottom to deteriorate, and the plaque got loose. And so divers recovered it. It was brought to the Bay State Council of Divers, and then they transferred it to BUAR. And all of us want it displayed somewhere where it's not going to come loose again, and where it can be seen by a lot of people, including those who don't dive. So the board has, we have donated it to the Maritime Museum here in Cohasset, and it'll become part of the exhibit for the Minus Light. And I think that's a good place for it. We're all happy about that. And there's going to be a rededication ceremony event in next year.
Yes. I forget the date in April, but it's in April 1851. I forget the specific date.
Okay, but you'll let people know.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
And then we have historical aircraft wrecks, and those are mostly from the World War II training that was done here. A lot of military aircraft. So that gives you just a taste of kind of the variety of resources that we have here. I wanted to talk to you about the management challenge that has been most immediate to me since I've been in this job for now 6 years. And that is the threats to coastal cultural resources from sea level rise, related erosion, and responses to that erosion. So efforts to prevent the coast from being deteriorated, prevent it from sea level rise impacting property and life. Those have impacts too. So if you armor a shoreline with riprap, with big stones, and there's delicate cultural resources there, things like waterlogged shipwrecks, they're going to be impacted. If you're out offshore dredging sand to use in a beach replenishment project, you could impact ancient native sites. You could impact a shipwreck. And even if you're doing a low impact type of coastal stabilization project, that too can have an impact. So the impacts to coastal cultural resources aren't just from the natural things that are happening, but they're also from our responses to them. So that's a problem. That's a problem for my office, for me. And in the 6 years, well, actually it was, I guess, 3 years that I had been on the job, I got lots of phone calls from people reporting things they were seeing eroding or being washed up on the beach. And so I was plotting where all these things were. I tried to get locations for them. And I started thinking about where they were showing up. And so this big map here, these stars, these are where the reported, they correspond not so much to the exact locations, this is a really general map, but to the towns where they were found. And so these are locations where things were being reported that were eroding. And I thought, what do we know about erosion in the state? And so Coastal Zone Management had actually done a report about 10 years before I was looking at this, so like 10 or 15 years ago, where they identified areas along the coast that had the highest rates of erosion. And you can see the communities in this other map, they're red dots. Now, look at what the relationship is between those things. There is an apparent relationship, but that's not science, that's intuition, right? You're just looking and going, So I felt like, well, we need to do some science. And, so I was thinking about this, but what really brought it home that this is a huge problem was this beautiful shipwreck that was on Steep Hill Beach for 110 years. Mostly looking like that. Sometimes it would be buried, sometimes it would be exposed. But over the last, for about 5 years before 2020, so from 2015 to 2020, this thing had progressively been becoming more and more exposed. And by the fall of 2020, it was almost entirely exposed, sitting on the beach. And Graham was on our board, Graham McKay, the director of Bolt Boat Shop. He had alerted me to this, and he said, we ought to get out there and do some documentation. I said, yeah, you're right, we should. And so we were planning on doing that, but Hurricane Teddy passed off the coast, not close, but a long ways off, but it created huge seas, huge winds, and they hit right when we had king tides, the really large autumnal tides in this case, because it was September. And the combination of those big tides and the big waves turned this beautiful wreck into this overnight. Shredded it and scattered it over 18 acres of beach. The whole length of Steep Hill Beach was covered in timbers. I get a call from the trustees, Carol McCauley, who was working with the trustees at the time, saying, hey, we had that really cool shipwreck on Steep Hill Beach, remember that one? It's gone. It's in a million pieces, what do we do? And so it's not common for you to deal with a shipwreck that shipwrecks twice. But that's what we had here. And I was instantly in a situation where I had to react as opposed to think about things, have time to plan. So, we went through the process, the best process we could, which is one, safety is most important. So alerted the Coast Guard that there may be debris in the water, alerted the harbor master, put out a notice to mariners, and then went about documenting what was there and exposed before it changed again, because it was going to change. And so we collected baseline documentation of the site and have been tracking it ever since. And we've tracked timbers that have moved over a quarter mile. So this thing is mobile. These are not static sites. And so we're learning a lot, and that's the opportunity part that I mentioned. For a long time, this thing was completely buried. Then it became exposed, and when it got ripped apart, it actually became much more accessible for documentation and study. Things that had been buried under other planks now were visible. Things like Roman numerals scribed into some of the frames, and tool marks that would tell you whether the shipbuilder was left-handed or right-handed. I mean, little details like that that were preserved in the wood because it had been buried and kept wet for the entire time that this thing had been on the beach. So there are opportunities to learn, but boy, you got to jump on them fast because your window is very brief. And so that reacting to those situations is not optimal. Proactively thinking about how to go about documenting these sites before they're totally destroyed, that is a better approach, I think.
Obviously, might there be an optimal time to intervene and then remove it from the site? Is that?
Yeah, so we just got a really good question. Is there an optimal time to intervene and then potentially remove these resources from the site? That is certainly an option. The problem is that when you remove something from its context, you now have to care for it. And waterlogged wood, metals that have been exposed, and ceramics and glass that have been exposed to salt water, they will disintegrate unless they are conserved and then curated in a climate controlled space. So you immediately have a conservation problem, and then you have a curation problem. And all that's expensive. All of it requires specialized staff and space. And so you have to be very careful about when you make a decision on whether or not you're going to actually remove something and take it on as a perpetual care issue. So in most cases, again, we don't have a budget, so we'd have to get grant money to do that. But in most cases, our best option is to document as much as we can in place. And do like we did with the trustees. We created an educational program to share that site with the public.
Is there such a thing as a priority list, though, of those that really?
She just mentioned, is there a priority list? There should be. I like your thinking.
I jumped the gun.
Oh, no, you're right there with me. You're right there with me. So just to give you a sense, it's not, and it's not just like my map showed. It's kind of happening all over the state. So places, yes, at Steep Hill Beach in Ipswich, but also on Martha's Vineyard, ancient sites in Shillmark at Lucy Vincent Beach. They're eroding right onto the beach and into the ocean. Ancient cultural landscape in North Plymouth, where somebody found what appears to be a wooden bow, which would be the first archaeological example of a wooden bow that we have. And he found it along with that white arrowhead or projectile point right here that was about this big. It was a big one, and pure quartz. So this could be a very sensitive site, but it's actively eroding. And in fact, the landform that came out of is gone. We're right in the process right now of trying to radiocarbon date the bow, or if it is a bow, see how old it is. Wrexham Beach in Marshfield, not too far from here, got an eroding ancient landscape in the form of this organic material that you see here exposed, and there was a shipwreck as well on that beach. Again, eroding. You might have heard this in the news a few years ago. Shipwreck on the south side of Nantucket. Again, eroding. This is another really unique find. This is a wooden fish weir, a wooden fish trap, very much like what you see in this picture here. And eroding from the tip of Castle Neck, which is at the mouth of the Essex River, is where Crane Beach, the southern end of Crane Beach is. The tip of that peninsula of land has eroded drastically just in the last few years. It exposed this, we radiocarbon dated it pre-contact period. It's, I think, the only wooden fish weir that we know of other than the Boylston Street fish weir that was in Boston. It's very famous. So rare. This is a 19th century, mid-19th century shipwreck off of Canomo Point that is in 2022, when I first saw it, 6 timber, just the very tops of these were visible. I was out there last week and it's starting to look a lot like the Ada K Damon. It's becoming more and more exposed. Walker's Creek, the channel is migrated, is now flowing over the port side of the hull and scouring out the bow. It's a site that we're monitoring. This is another site. This is in Essex Bay. This is an older wreck, probably from the, the early 1800s or late 1700s. The channel, again, migration of the channel westward as the mouth of Essex River is opening. A lot more energy coming in. It's shifting some of these bars to the west. This wreck is now under the middle of the channel. It's completely subtidal now. The channel's migrated, I don't know, 150, 200 yards, something like that. And that happened in a couple of years. Built resources along the coast, they're also at risk. Houses, the Southern Tide Mill in Quincy. So, to your point about prioritizing, I decided, and working with colleagues at CZM, we put together a proposal to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, for a project of special merit grant that would allow us to, for the first time in the history of the state, characterize the densities of the cultural resources along the coast and then figure out where along the coast they're most vulnerable, so that we could then prioritize these areas for beginning a more granular tier 2 type of assessment and documentation done at the community level and the municipality level. So we applied for the funding. We got the funding in 2023. We've been working on it since December of 2023, and we're wrapping it up this summer. And I'm going to share with you some of the information that we've derived from doing this work. I can tell you it was basically a GIS exercise, Geographic Information Systems. It's a computer program that, it's a mapping program. And so what we thought was, we know we had, the Massachusetts Historical Commission has something called MACRIS. It's a password protected database of different types of archaeological sites as well as built resources. The built resources part's accessible to the public because everybody can see those, but the archaeological resources are password protected for professional archaeologists to use. But it includes ancient native sites and also post-colonial sites, historic period sites. And so we ended up assessing 4 different types of sites: built resources, ancient native sites, post-contact period sites, and underwater archaeological resources in the intertidal that we have inventoried in our database. And we plotted those as densities, because we didn't want to create a treasure map for people to go and find things and then loop the sites. So we had to kind of fuzzy things up, make them a little bit vaguer so they were more like heat maps, where you could see where the densities were greater and where they were less dense. And then overlay that information with previously documented and predicted shoreline locations and places where the shoreline was eroding. So there's multiple agencies that have mapped that, including CZM. And then compare those things. So compare the density of resources where the shoreline's likely to change the most, or is most dynamic, or is going to flood, to then come up with the vulnerability. And we're right now finishing it's called a geo-narrative. They're also called story maps, but it's going to be an online resource that anybody can pull up and see some of these maps that I'm going to share with you, the finalized versions of them, as well as the final report that we're working on. And it describes the project, just gives a nice little summary, but it'll be accessible to everyone, so you guys will be able to see that. I think I've explained the goals, but basically we wanted to characterize and assess the vulnerability on a very high level, very general scale for the entire state, so that we could prioritize where to go, focus our efforts, our limited resources, working with communities like yours. And I always think about, you guys are interested in history. You're here for a reason. So at some point, because Cohasset is one of the communities that has vulnerability, heightened vulnerability, you guys hopefully we'll be seeing each other again, and we'll get to do some documentation on it. So using data from USGS, from NOAA, from FEMA, from our own work, CZM's own work, we were able to create this generalized map of basically of risk. This is the part everywhere you see in red. Those are essentially the hazard, the heightened hazard zone, based on all these different pieces of information. And then we took that and laid a grid over it every node, every square of this grid touched on some part of that hazard extent. And so that became our analysis extent, or our study area. And then plotting the densities of the different types of resources we were looking at. So this is MHC inventory of historic properties. So these are essentially like built resources. And high density is blue, lower density is the light lime kind of green. So that's a density map of those types of resources there. And when it's overlaid with the hazards map, you get, this is a vulnerability map. And you can see they're different, they're not the same. So that map, those two maps that I showed you, the one with the stars and the one with the circles, and we could all look at them and go, oh yeah, it looks like there's a relationship there. That was intuitive analysis. But when you actually do more detailed analysis, you don't get necessarily the same result. You get areas that are vulnerable, more vulnerable, that might not have as high a density of sites, but they're more vulnerable because the topography is different, because the coastline is different. So it's why doing this level of analysis is important, not just intuitively trying to figure it out. So there's a whole series of these maps. These are archaeological sites, post-colonial archaeological sites. Again, density, vulnerability. These are the ancient indigenous archaeological sites, density, vulnerability. And these are the BUAR inventoried intertidal site density map and vulnerability. And then this is a map that we just created just for this talk that gives you a sense of which of the communities, this is the prioritization that you're talking about. So we found that there were 23 municipalities that had vulnerabilities that were either high or medium high, we categorize them. And so that's everything that you see in this kind of pale yellow, all those areas there. And you might notice one here, Cohasset. So you're among those 23. And then of those, we had 6 that had at least one category of resource that was high. And those are indicated by these crosshatched areas. And then we had communities that we had 8 communities that had high or medium high priority management areas across at least 2 or more of the different resource types. So again, an elevated risk, and those are marked with the blue stars. And it's not, the way this map is done, it's done for clarity, so it makes sense when you're looking at it at this scale, but this only applies to our study area. It doesn't apply to the whole municipality. So it's not the whole municipality that's got the vulnerability. It's just within our study area along the coast, but that would have been too hard to see at this level. So what can you as citizens do to help me with this enormous task of being the state underwater archaeologist for all the state's waters, for all these resources that belong to all of us? Well, one very simple way is if you're walking along the beach and you see something that you think, this looks like it could be an archaeological resource. Go on the BUAR website, and we have a downloadable 1-page form, the SHIPS form, and you just fill it out, put some very basic information. Feel free to send me an email, and if you want help filling it out, I will be more than happy to help you fill it out. And then you submit it to us, and then it becomes part of this record that we use. You are acting as my eyes to inventory these things essentially before they're gone. There's another way that soon, I hope, you're going to be able to be involved, and that's through another program that we're going to start called STAMP. They don't have acronyms. and it's the Shipwreck Tagging Archaeological Management Program. And this is actually a nationwide program. It's been adopted in the state of Massachusetts by the National Park Service, who has adopted it nationwide along the coast of America. And it's a program that was created by a guy as a master's thesis project, who now works for the Florida, he works with the Florida Public Archaeology Network and the University of West Florida. And what he conceived was this brilliant idea of tagging shipwreck timbers and chunks of shipwrecks with a tag that has one of those codes that you can scan with your cell phone. And then it takes you to a website where, like our ships form, you can just fill in the information on your phone. You can upload photographs, you can upload a GPS position, and then that goes into the ship's database that's managed by the Florida Public Archaeology Network and the University of West Florida. And you can become, Massachusetts can become a partner in that, just like Maryland has and Virginia has and Florida and Texas have. And I just last week was working with EA Legal to get the language of that agreement finalized the way it needs to be for the state of Massachusetts. Now we got to present it to the state of Florida and get them to sign off. And so we are really close to being able to do this. And so there'll be another way that you can help us record these things and be a part of the development of that record and protecting these resources that belong to us. Paul. So that's it. That's all I got. It's a lot of talking.
Thank you.
A lot of listening. Happy to answer any questions that you may have.